I should have known something was off when my grandfather showed up to my 28th birthday brunch wearing his "I'm about to drop some wisdom" smile, the one that made his eyes crinkle like expensive leather, the kind of smile that said he'd just written another check that would make someone's year. We were at the Terrace, this bougie spot in Greenwich where the mimosas cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and the waitstaff moved like they were auditioning for a ballet about serving eggs Benedict. My whole family was there, dressed like they'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. All pastel colors and expensive watches that could have paid my rent for 6 months. My mom, Patricia, kept adjusting her Cartier bracelet like it was personally offending her wrist. My dad, Richard, was doing that thing where he pretended to read the menu even though he'd been ordering the same damn lobster omelet for 15 years. My older sister, Madison, sat across from me with her husband Trevor, both of them looking like they just closed a deal that would buy them another vacation home. And then there was my younger brother, Chase, scrolling through his phone like the rest of us were NPCs in his personal video game. "Rose, darling," Grandpa William said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with his weathered one, the one that had signed contracts worth millions. "I'm so glad you're enjoying that apartment I bought you. Prime real estate in the city, just like I promised when you graduated. You've always been my special girl." The words hung in the air like champagne bubbles, pretty and fragile and about to burst. My mom's face lit up with that proud smile she reserved for when she thought her kids were living up to the family name. Madison nodded approvingly, probably already imagining herself inheriting something equally valuable. My dad looked up from his menu with this satisfied expression, like everything in his world was finally aligning the way it should. But here's the thing about family secrets. They're like cockroaches. They thrive in the dark until someone flips on the light. I felt my throat tighten, felt the weight of 3 years of silence pressing against my chest like a boulder. 3 years of coming home to a basement apartment in Queens that smelled like old carpet and the neighbors cooking. 3 years of pretending everything was fine while my family lived in their bubble of privilege, thinking Grandpa's generosity had extended to me the way it had to everyone else. 3 years of watching my brother get his startup funded, my sister get her down payment covered, my parents get their kitchen renovation bankrolled, while I scraped by on my nonprofit salary and whatever freelance graphic design work I could hustle on the side. I'd told myself I'd speak up eventually, that I'd find the right moment to ask why I'd been left out, but the right moment never came. Because admitting you've been forgotten by your own family feels like admitting you're not worth remembering. "I live in a basement," I whispered, and I swear to God, it was like I'd announced I was joining a cult. My dad's fork clattered against his plate, sending a piece of smoked salmon flying onto the pristine white tablecloth. My mom's hand froze mid-reach for her mimosa. Madison's perfectly threaded eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her highlighted hair. Chase actually looked up from his phone, which was probably the most shocking part of all. Grandpa William's smile faltered, confusion creasing his face like someone had just told him his stock portfolio had tanked. "What do you mean, sweetie?" my mom asked, her voice doing that thing where it got all high and tight, like she was trying to keep a lid on something that was already boiling over. "You live in the apartment on Park Avenue, the one your grandfather bought, the 2-bedroom with the view of the park?" I could see her mentally calculating, trying to figure out where the wires had crossed, how her perfect family narrative had developed this glitch. She reached for her water glass like it might contain answers, her manicured nails clicking against the crystal. "No, Mom, I don't," I said, and my voice was steadier now, fueled by 3 years of resentment that I'd been swallowing like bad medicine. "I live in a basement apartment in Elmhurst. It's got one window that looks out at someone's garbage cans, and when it rains, water seeps through the walls. I haven't lived in any apartment Grandpa bought because Grandpa never bought me an apartment." The silence that followed was so thick, you could have cut it with the steak knives that cost $50 each. I watched my family's faces cycle through shock, confusion, and something that looked almost like embarrassment, but not quite enough like guilt. Grandpa William's face had gone pale, his hand trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "That's impossible," he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. I transferred the money 3 years ago, $250,000, specifically for your apartment. I had my accountant, Gerald, handle everything. He showed me the paperwork, the deed, everything. His eyes were searching mine like I was lying, like I was the one who'd somehow messed this up, and I felt this hot anger rising in my chest because even now, even with the truth sitting right there on the table between us, I could see him trying to find a way that this was somehow my fault. Well, somebody's lying, I said, and I could hear the edge in my voice, sharp enough to cut through all the bullshit politeness we'd been drowning in. I never got any paperwork. I never even got a conversation about it. You know what I got? A text from Mom 3 years ago saying, "Glad you're all settled in your new place." Like I was supposed to know what the hell that meant. I pulled out my phone, scrolled back through 3 years of messages until I found it, held it up like evidence in a trial. See? That's it. That's all the communication I got about this mystery apartment that apparently exists somewhere in a parallel universe where I'm not struggling to pay my bills. My dad had gone from pale to red, that vein in his forehead pulsing the way it did when someone questioned his authority. "Rose, why didn't you say something sooner?" he demanded. And I almost laughed because of course that's where we were going. Of course this was going to be about what I did wrong. If there was some kind of mistake, you should have brought it to our attention immediately. We could have sorted this out years ago. He said it like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the problem that needed solving, and I felt something crack inside me, some dam that had been holding back 3 years of rage. "Are you seriously asking me that?" I shot back, my voice rising enough that the couple at the next table looked over, their own brunch drama temporarily forgotten. "Are you seriously sitting there, in your custom suit that probably cost more than my rent, asking me why I didn't beg for your attention? Maybe because every time I tried to bring up money or help or anything, I got the 'Rose needs to learn to stand on her own 2 feet' speech. Maybe because Madison got her wedding paid for and Chase got his business funded and I got lectures about financial responsibility? Maybe because I spent my whole life watching you guys help everyone else while I was supposed to figure it out alone because I was so independent and so capable that I didn't need help." The words were tumbling out now. All the things I've been thinking for years, all the resentment I'd been storing up like ammunition for a war I never wanted to fight. Madison cleared her throat, exchanging a look with Trevor that I couldn't quite read. "Rose, I think you're being a little dramatic," she said in that condescending tone she'd perfected over years of being the golden child. "We all thought you had the apartment. If you were struggling, you could have asked for help. You don't get to play the victim because you were too proud to speak up." She dabbed at her lips with her napkin like this whole conversation was just an unfortunate mess she needed to clean up. And I wanted to throw my mimosa in her face, watch the orange juice drip down her designer dress. "Too proud?" I repeated, my laugh bitter enough to curdle milk. "Madison, you literally posted on Instagram about the down payment Grandpa gave you for your brownstone. Chase has been posting about his investor for 2 years. Everyone in this family got help except me, and now you're telling me it's my fault for not begging, for not realizing that there was supposed to be money that I never received?" I turned to my grandfather, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. "Grandpa, who handled the transfer? Who was supposed to give me this money?" His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling over the screen in a way that would have been endearing if I wasn't so angry I could barely see straight. "Gerald set everything up," he muttered, scrolling through what I assumed were emails. "He said he'd coordinated with your father to make sure everything was transferred properly. Richard, you said you'd handle getting Rose the information, that you'd make sure she understood the trust conditions." He looked up at my dad with something between confusion and accusation, and I watched my father's face go through about 17 different emotions in 2 seconds. My dad's jaw clenched, his eyes darting to my mom and then back to Grandpa William. "I gave the information to Patricia," he said slowly, each word carefully measured. "She said she'd talk to Rose about it, explain the setup, make sure she understood how to access the funds." And just like that, the spotlight swung to my mother, who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Her face had drained of color, her hands gripping her napkins so hard her knuckles were white. Patricia? Grandpa's voice was soft but deadly, the tone he used in boardrooms when someone had screwed up badly enough to cost the company money. You were supposed to talk to Rose about this 3 years ago. You were supposed to make sure she got set up in her apartment. What happened? The question hung there like a guillotine blade, just waiting to drop. And I watched my father's face go through about 17 different emotions in 2 seconds. My mom opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air. I thought, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I thought Rose was doing fine. She never complained. She always said she was handling things. I didn't think she needed, but she couldn't finish because even she knew how weak that sounded, how pathetic that excuse was when we all knew she'd been checking on Madison's renovation progress weekly and calling Chase to discuss his business plan monthly. You didn't think I needed $250,000? I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Or you didn't think I needed the same consideration you gave your other kids? Which one isn't, Mom? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you just forgot about me. Like I was so unimportant that a massive financial gift just slipped your mind. Like I wasn't worth the 30-second conversation it would have taken to say, hey, Grandpa set up some money for you. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to cry, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. The table had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. This time everyone was staring at my mother, waiting for an explanation that could make sense of this, that could explain how a mother forgets to tell her daughter about life-changing money. Madison had put down her fork, her expression something between shocked and calculating. Chase was recording on his phone until my dad shot him a look that could have melted steel. Trevor was trying to disappear into his chair, probably wishing he'd stayed home. And Grandpa William just looked sad, devastatingly sad, in a way that made him look every one of his 83 years. There's more to this, my mom finally said, her voice cracking. There's something you don't understand about the situation, about why things happened the way they did. But this isn't the place, Rose. We should talk about this at home, as a family, in private. She was using her corporate voice now, the one she used when she was trying to control a narrative, trying to manage a crisis. But I was done being managed, done being controlled. No, I said firmly, pushing back from the table hard enough that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. No, we're going to talk about this right now because I'm done with the secrets and the private conversations that somehow never include me. You're going to tell me right here, right now, what happened to that money. Where did it go? Because it sure as hell didn't come to me. I stood up, my napkin falling to the floor, my whole body vibrating with anger and hurt and 3 years of feeling like I didn't matter. My mom looked at my dad, some silent communication passing between them, and I saw him give the tiniest nod. She took a deep breath, her hands clasping together in front of her like she was praying, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet I had to lean in to hear her. The money went to Madison, she said, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. We were in a bad spot 3 years ago. Your father's business had some issues, some investments that went south, and we needed liquid capital fast. Madison and Trevor were about to lose their house, the one they'd just bought. We borrowed from your fund temporarily, planning to pay it back before you needed it. We thought you were stable, thought you had time, thought we could fix everything before you ever knew. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. Madison's face had gone white, her eyes wide with something that might have been guilt if she was capable of feeling it. I didn't know, she said quickly, too quickly. I thought it was a loan from Mom and Dad. I didn't know it was Rose's money. But even as she said it, I could see the lie in her eyes, could see that she'd known exactly where that money came from, had known and taken it anyway, because that's what Madison did. She took what she wanted and called it her due. You gave my money to Madison? I repeated slowly, trying to make the words make sense, trying to understand how my own mother could look at her struggling daughter and choose the other one.
You took a gift meant for me, a gift that could have changed my life, and you gave it to the daughter who already had everything. You let me live in a basement, let me struggle, let me think I was forgotten, all so Madison could keep her precious brownstone. I was shaking now, my whole body trembling with rage so pure it felt like fire in my veins. "We were going to pay you back," my dad said. But his voice had no conviction, no real belief behind it. "We just needed more time. The business is recovering now and we could—" But I cut him off with a laugh that was all edges and no humor, a sound that made everyone at nearby tables turn to stare. "You had 3 years," I spat out. 3 years to tell me the truth. 3 years to make it right. 3 years where you watched me struggle and said nothing. And you know what the worst part is? You probably never would have told me. If Grandpa hadn't brought it up today, I'd still be in the dark, still thinking I was the forgotten one, the one who didn't matter enough for Grandpa's generosity. You would have just let me keep believing that. I grabbed my purse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it off the back of my chair. Grandpa Williams stood up, his hand reaching for me. "Rose, sweetheart, I had no idea. If I'd known, I would have—" But I stepped back, not wanting his touch, not wanting anyone's touch right now because I felt like I might shatter into a million pieces if anyone tried to comfort me. "It's not your fault, Grandpa," I said, and I meant it, because he was the only one who'd actually tried to help me, even if his help had been stolen before it ever reached me. "You did what you thought was right. It's them." I gestured at my parents, at Madison, at the whole poisonous family dynamic that had been rotting under the surface for years, who decided I wasn't worth the truth, who decided Madison's comfort was more important than my survival. I slung my purse over my shoulder, my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed in front of them. "Where are you going?" my mom asked, standing up like she might try to stop me. "Rose, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to fix this." But her words were empty, meaningless platitudes that couldn't undo 3 years of lies and neglect. "I'm going back to my basement," I said, my voice cold and hard. "The one I've been living in while you all pretended everything was fine. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't show up at my place thinking you can throw money at this and make it better. You made your choice 3 years ago, and I'm making mine now." I turned and walked out of that restaurant with my head high and my heart in pieces, past the tables full of families who probably had their own secrets and lies, out into the bright sunshine that felt offensive in its cheerfulness. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop, leaning against a building as the sobs finally came, great heaving gasps that felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside. People walked past, giving me that wide berth New Yorkers reserve for public emotional breakdowns, and I didn't care. I didn't care that I was crying on the street like some melodramatic character in a bad movie. I didn't care that my mascara was probably running down my face in black rivers. All I cared about was the fact that my family had stolen from me, had chosen my sister over me, had let me struggle while they lived in luxury built on money that should have been mine. And as I stood there, shaking and crying and falling apart, I felt something else start to build inside me. Something cold and determined and absolutely done with being the forgotten daughter. If they wanted to play dirty, if they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, then fine. I'd show them exactly what happens when you push someone into a corner and leave them no choice but to fight their way out. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, because the girl they'd overlooked for so long was about to remind them that being underestimated is the best weapon you can have, and I was ready to use it.
Turns out, rage is a hell of a motivator when you've got nothing left to lose. I spent the first week after the brunch drowning in anger so toxic it could have eaten through steel, ignoring the 57 calls from my mother, the 32 texts from Madison that ranged from defensive to apologetic to outright hostile, and the pathetic voicemail from my dad that basically amounted to, "Let's all calm down and be reasonable." Reasonable.
Like there was anything reasonable about stealing $250,000 from your own daughter and watching her struggle for 3 years without saying a damn word. Chase tried the, hey sis, this is kind of messed up approach, but even he couldn't commit to being on my side because that would require him to actually pick a position instead of floating through life on Grandpa's money and everyone else's goodwill. The only person I talked to was Grandpa William, who called me personally, his voice heavy with guilt that wasn't his to carry, promising he'd get to the bottom of this if it was the last thing he did. That conversation lasted 45 minutes and ended with both of us crying, him apologizing for trusting the wrong people, me reassuring him that he was the only one in this family who'd actually tried to do right by me. The second week, I got strategic. See, here's what my family didn't know about me, what they'd never bothered to find out during all those years they were too busy focusing on Madison's perfect life and Chase's entrepreneurial dreams. I wasn't just some nonprofit worker bee pushing papers for peanuts. I'd spent 3 years working for the Coalition for Financial Justice, an organization that specialized in tracking down financial fraud, helping people navigate stolen funds, and building cases against family members who'd misappropriated inheritances and trusts. I knew forensic accountants. I knew lawyers who took cases pro bono when the story was compelling enough. I knew exactly how to pull back the curtain on financial deception. And my family had just handed me the kind of case that made attorneys salivate. So I started making calls, starting with my colleague Marcus, who'd worked in wealth management before his moral compass kicked in and he switched sides to help people instead of screwing them over. Girl, this is insane, Marcus said when I laid out the whole story over coffee at this dive near my office, his eyes getting wider with every detail. Your parents straight up embezzled from you. That's not borrowing, that's not a family loan, that's theft. And the fact that they let you struggle while they knew you had money coming, that's some next-level psychological manipulation. He was already pulling out his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard like he was conducting a symphony of revenge. We need to pull your grandfather's financial records, track the money transfer, establish a paper trail that proves intent. If your mom redirected funds that were specifically designated for you, we can build a case for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and about 6 other charges that will make their lawyers wet themselves. I felt something fierce and satisfied bloom in my chest, this cold determination that felt better than any therapy session could have. I want everything, I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Every email, every document, every transfer record. I want to know exactly how they did this, who knew what when, and how deep the lies go. Because I guarantee you this isn't just about the apartment money. People who steal once don't usually stop there. Marcus grinned at me, this shark-like expression that told me he was already 3 steps ahead, already planning the kind of investigation that would strip away every carefully constructed lie my family had built. You know what we need? He said, leaning back in his chair with that look he got when he was about to suggest something brilliant or crazy or both. We need to talk to Gerald, your grandpa's accountant. He's the linchpin here. He handled the transfer, which means he has documentation of where the money was supposed to go versus where it actually went. If we can get him to cooperate, or even just get access to his records, we can prove that your parents deliberately intercepted funds that weren't theirs. He paused, studying my face. But Rose, you need to be sure about this. Once we start pulling this thread, everything's gonna unravel. Your family's gonna lawyer up, things are gonna get ugly, and there's no going back to Sunday dinners and pretending everything's fine. There's nothing to go back to, I said flatly, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. They already made their choice. They chose Madison's comfort over my survival. They chose lying to me for 3 years over having one honest conversation. I'm just choosing not to be their victim anymore. Marcus nodded, that look of respect in his eyes that I'd been craving from my actual family, and pulled up a contact list of forensic accountants who owed him favors. Within an hour, we had a meeting set up for the following day with a woman named Diana Chen, who apparently had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to tracking dirty money. That night, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to Madison's brownstone, that
beautiful 4-story monument to theft that my money had helped save. And I sat in my beat-up Honda across the street, watching the warm light glowing from the windows. I could see shadows moving inside, Madison and Trevor probably enjoying their evening, maybe drinking wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, completely unbothered by the fact that their comfortable life was built on screwing me over.
The rage that had been simmering inside me boiled over, and I found myself getting out of the car, walking up those pristine steps, and ringing the doorbell before I could talk myself out of it. The door opened, and there was Madison, looking casually perfect in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, her face cycling through surprise to annoyance to something that might have been fear when she saw the expression on my face. "Rose," she said, her hand tightening on the door frame like she might need to slam it in my face. "This isn't a good time. Trevor and I are about to have dinner, and I don't think—" But I pushed past her into that gorgeous foyer with its original hardwood floors and designer lighting, my wet shoes tracking mud on the Persian rug that probably cost $5,000, and I turned to face her with 3 years of resentment burning in my eyes. "You knew," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't stand there and lie to me anymore, Madison. You knew that money was supposed to be mine. You knew, and you took it anyway, and you let me live in a basement while you enjoyed this palace built on my stolen future." I gestured around at the expensive artwork, the custom built-ins, all the markers of wealth that should have been shared, that could have been if she'd had even a shred of decency. Madison's face hardened, that perfect mask of the golden child slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You want to know the truth?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Fine. Yes, I knew. Mom told me the money was supposed to be yours, but she also told me you didn't need it as badly as we did. You were single, no kids, living some bohemian lifestyle working for nonprofits. Trevor and I had just bought this house. We had real responsibilities, real expenses, and Dad's business tanking meant we were about to lose everything we'd worked for. So yeah, when Mom and Dad offered to help us out with available funds, I didn't ask too many questions. Because I knew if I did, they might say no." She crossed her arms, defensive and defiant, not a hint of real remorse in her eyes. "Available funds?" I repeated, my laugh bitter and broken. "Is that what they called it? My inheritance? My gift from Grandpa? Money that was specifically designated for me, and they just rebranded it as available funds so you could sleep at night?" I stepped closer to her, watching her take an instinctive step back. "You didn't work for this house, Madison. I did. I worked for 3 years in a basement that floods when it rains, worked double shifts, freelancing after my day job, worked my ass off thinking I was just behind, just not successful enough yet, while you lived in luxury that I paid for." "Oh, please," Madison shot back, her face flushing with anger. "You could have asked for help any time. You could have told someone you were struggling. But no, you had to be so independent, so above needing family support, walking around with your pride like it was some kind of shield. Maybe if you'd been more involved in the family, more present at dinners and holidays, Mom and Dad would have thought about you when the money came up. But you were always off doing your own thing, acting like you were too good for us." Her words were like poison, designed to hurt, designed to make me doubt myself. "I was working," I said through gritted teeth, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "I was working because I didn't have the safety net you had. I didn't have parents paying for my wedding or covering my down payment or bailing me out when things got tough. I had to actually earn everything I got, unlike you, who's been coasting on family money your whole life and calling it success." I could see Trevor hovering in the doorway to the dining room, looking uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to actually intervene or defend me. Madison's eyes flashed with something vicious. "You know what your problem is, Rose? You think being poor makes you noble, like struggling somehow makes you better than the rest of us, but it just makes you bitter and jealous and pathetic. We're family, we help each other out, and sometimes that means money goes where it's needed most. You survived without it, didn't you? You're fine. So maybe stop acting like we ruined your life and accept that not everything is about you." She said it with such conviction, such absolute belief that she was right that I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. "I'm filing charges," I said calmly, and I watched the color drain from her face. Fraud, embezzlement, theft. I've got lawyers, I've got forensic accountants, and I've got a paper trail that's going to prove exactly what you and Mom and Dad did. You're going to lose this house, Madison. You're going to lose everything you stole from me, and you're going to learn what it feels like to have your future ripped away because someone decided they deserved it more than you did. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of her shocked expression, another of the foyer, documentation for the case I was building. "You can't do that." She stammered, but her voice had lost its confidence, fear creeping in around the edges. "We're family. You can't sue your own family over money. Grandpa would never forgive you, and Mom and Dad would—" But I cut her off with a look that could have frozen hell. "Mom and Dad already burned that bridge when they stole from me," I said coldly. "And Grandpa is the one who's helping me build the case. He's furious, Madison. The golden child might finally have to face consequences for once in her privileged life." I headed for the door, done with this conversation, done with her excuses and justifications. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers. Enjoy the house while you still can." I slammed the door behind me hard enough to rattle the expensive windows, my heart pounding with adrenaline and satisfaction and this fierce joy that came from finally fighting back. I could hear Madison shouting something inside, probably calling Trevor or Mom or her own lawyer, but I didn't care. I'd drawn my line in the sand, and there was no going back now. The drive home to my basement felt different somehow. Less depressing and more temporary, like I was just passing through on my way to something better, something I was going to build with my own two hands, out of the ashes of my family's betrayal. The meeting with Diana Chen was everything Marcus had promised and more. She walked into the conference room of my nonprofit like she owned the place. This tiny woman in a designer suit with eyes that could see through bullshit at 50 paces. And within 10 minutes of me telling my story, she had her laptop open and was already mapping out a strategy. "This is clean," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Cleaner than most family theft cases because your grandfather has documentation of intent. He transferred money specifically designated for you. There's a paper trail of him asking about your apartment. And your parents diverted those funds without your knowledge or consent. That's textbook embezzlement." She looked up at me with something like approval. "The fact that you work in financial justice is going to play well, too. You're not some spoiled rich kid fighting over inheritance. You're someone who was genuinely harmed by this theft, who struggled while the people who stole from you lived in luxury." "What are we looking at in terms of legal options?" I asked, my pen poised over my notebook like I was back in college taking notes on the most important exam of my life. Diana pulled up a document on her screen, turned it so I could see, and I felt my eyes widen at the list of potential charges and civil remedies available. Criminal charges are possible but harder to prove because you need to establish intent to permanently deprive, and they'll argue it was always meant to be a temporary loan, Diana explained, her voice crisp and professional. But civil court? That's where we'll destroy them. Breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, fraud, constructive trust. We can argue that your parents held that money in trust for you and violated that trust by giving it to Madison. We can sue for the full amount plus 3 years of interest, plus damages for emotional distress, plus punitive damages if we can prove their conduct was willfully malicious. She smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. We're probably looking at a total claim of somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 when all is said and done. The number hit me like a physical thing, stealing my breath for a moment. That would bankrupt them, I said slowly, and Diana nodded without a trace of sympathy. "Yes, it would," she agreed. "Your parents' business is already recovering from financial trouble, and your sister's house is mortgaged to the hilt. A judgment that size would force them to liquidate assets, possibly filed for bankruptcy, definitely destroy their credit and reputation." That's the reality of consequences, Rose. If you go forward with this, you're not just getting your money back. You're potentially ending their comfortable lifestyle permanently. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine.
So you need to be absolutely sure this is what you want. Because once we file, there's no taking it back. Your family will hate you. Your relationships will be permanently destroyed. You'll be the villain in their story forever. I thought about Madison's face when I told her I was filing charges. Thought about my mom's pathetic excuses at the brunch. Thought about 3 years of struggling while they knew I'd been robbed and said nothing. "I'm sure," I said, my voice steady and certain. "File everything. I want them to understand that actions have consequences, even when you're family. Especially when you're family. Because they should have protected me instead of stealing from me." Diana nodded, already pulling up forms and documents. "We'll start with the demand letter, giving them 30 days to return the full amount plus interest. They'll refuse, their lawyers will try to negotiate a settlement, and then we'll file the lawsuit and start discovery. I'll need access to your grandfather's financial records, any communication you have with your family about money or your living situation, and permission to subpoena your parents' bank accounts and your sister's mortgage records." She was in full battle mode now, and I felt the surge of gratitude for her cold efficiency, her willingness to fight for me when my own family wouldn't. "You'll have everything you need," I promised, "whatever it takes to make this right." We spent the next 2 hours going through documents, with me signing authorization forms and Diana explaining legal strategy with the kind of detail that made my head spin. By the time I left that meeting, I had a lawyer on retainer, a case being built, and a deadline hanging over my family's head like a sword. The demand letter hit 3 days later, delivered by courier to my parents' house, Madison's brownstone, and even Chase's apartment because Diana believed in being thorough. I'd turned off my phone, knowing the explosion was coming, not ready to deal with the fallout just yet. But I couldn't hide forever. And that evening, there was pounding on my basement door. The kind of aggressive knocking that made my neighbors crack their doors to see what the drama was. I opened it to find my father standing there, his face purple with rage, the demand letter crumpled in his fist. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, and I could smell the scotch on his breath, could see the panic underneath the anger. "You're suing us, your own family, over money that we were going to pay back?" He tried to push past me into my apartment, but I stood my ground, blocking the doorway with my body. "You had 3 years to pay it back. You had 3 years to tell me the truth. This isn't about the money anymore, Dad. This is about the fact that you all looked at me struggling and decided Madison's comfort was more important than my survival."
You made your choice and I'm making mine. I could see neighbors watching now, probably recording on their phones, and I didn't care. Let them see what happens when you push someone too far. "If you go through with this, you're done," my dad threatened, his voice shaking with rage or fear or both. "You'll never be welcome in this family again. Your mother will never forgive you. Madison will never speak to you. You'll be alone, Rose, completely alone. And for what? Money? You're going to destroy your family over money?" He said it like I was the unreasonable one, like I was the villain in this story. And I felt that cold determination solidify into something unbreakable. "You destroyed this family when you stole from me," I shot back. "I'm just making sure everyone knows what you did. Now get off my property before I call the cops and add harassment to the list of charges." I slammed the door in his face, my hands shaking with adrenaline, and listened to him shout threats through the thin wood before finally stomping away. I slid down to the floor, my back against the door, and tried to catch my breath. This was really happening. I was really doing this. And somewhere in the chaos and fear and rage, I felt something else too. Liberation. Like I'd finally stopped carrying the weight of their expectations and their lies. Like I'd finally chosen myself over the family that had never chosen me. The next morning, I got a call from Grandpa William. His voice was tired but resolute, carrying news that would change everything. "Rose, I've been doing some digging into Gerald's records, and I found something bigger than we thought. Your parents didn't just steal your apartment money." He paused, and I could hear paper rustling in the background. "They've been systematically draining the family trust for years, taking funds that were designated for you and Chase and using them to cover their business losses and maintain their lifestyle. The trust fund your grandmother set up before she died, the one that was supposed to provide for all her grandchildren, they've embezzled nearly $2 million from it over the past decade. Rose, this isn't just about you. They've been stealing from the entire family. And I think Madison and Trevor might have known about more than just your apartment money. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate, and I felt my world shift on its axis one more time. Because this wasn't just about my stolen $250,000 anymore. This was about a pattern of theft so extensive it could send my parents to prison. And suddenly, the revenge I'd been planning felt like just the opening move in a much bigger game.
$2 million. The number kept echoing in my head like some sick mantra as I sat in Grandpa William's study 3 days after his bombshell revelation, surrounded by banker's boxes full of financial records that told the story of a decade-long con. Gerald, the accountant, had turned out to be more than willing to cooperate once Grandpa threatened to report him to the state board for his role in facilitating the theft. Turns out, my parents had been forging signatures, creating fake invoices, and systematically bleeding the family trust that Grandma Eleanor had set up before she died, money that was supposed to be untouchable until each grandchild turned 30. I was staring at Chase's portion, nearly $700,000 that should have been sitting in an account waiting for him in 2 years, except it wasn't there because Dad had used it to prop up his failing commercial real estate ventures, and Mom had siphoned off chunks to maintain their lifestyle of country club memberships and luxury vacations they could no longer afford. "They stole from Chase too," I said, my voice hollow as I flipped through spreadsheets that showed transfer after transfer, each one approved with forged trustee signatures. "He doesn't even know. He thinks his money is safe, thinks he's got this safety net waiting for him, and it's gone. They took it all." Grandpa William looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past week, his face gaunt and his hands trembling as he poured himself a scotch at 10 in the morning, something I'd never seen him do in my entire life. "Your grandmother would be devastated," he said quietly, staring at the portrait of her that hung over the fireplace, this beautiful woman with kind eyes who died when I was 15. "She set up that trust specifically to protect you kids from exactly this kind of thing. She knew your father had problems with money, knew he made risky investments and lived beyond his means. That's why she made the trust irrevocable, why she put conditions on it that were supposed to keep it safe." He downed the scotch in one swallow, grimacing. "But she didn't account for the fact that her own son would be willing to commit fraud to get around her protections. She didn't think he'd stoop that low." I felt rage and grief warring inside me, this toxic mix that made my chest feel tight. "What do we do now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, could feel it settling into my bones like concrete. This is bigger than a civil suit. This is criminal fraud on a massive scale. They could go to prison for this. The words should have scared me, should have made me hesitate, but instead I felt this cold satisfaction because finally there would be real consequences for what they'd done. Grandpa picked up his phone, his jaw set in that way that meant he'd made a decision and nothing would change his mind. "I'm calling the district attorney," he said firmly. "I'm turning over all the evidence, every document, every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer. Your parents are going to face criminal charges for what they've done to this family, and Madison and Trevor are going to be investigated as accessories if we can prove they knew about the larger scheme." He started dialing, then paused, looking at me with eyes that were sad but determined. "Rose, once I make this call, everything changes. Your parents could be arrested. Madison could lose everything. The family name will be dragged through the mud. Are you ready for that? Because there's no going back from this kind of scorched earth." I thought about 3 years in that basement. About the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't good enough for my own family's help. About every time I'd watched them live in luxury while I scraped by. I thought about Chase, who was about to have his world shattered when he found out his trust fund was empty. I thought about every family who'd come through my nonprofit with stories just like mine. Stories of parents and siblings who'd stolen inheritances and gotten away with it because nobody wanted to break up the family. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. "Make the call. Let's burn it all down." The next 72 hours were absolute chaos. The DA's office moved fast once they saw the evidence, assigning a prosecutor named Catherine Morrison, who apparently made her career going after white-collar criminals who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. Arrest warrants were issued for both my parents on charges of wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. I'll never forget the moment I saw my father's mugshot on the news, his face pale and shocked, looking every bit like the con artist he'd become. My mother had the audacity to cry during her perp walk, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue like she was the victim in all this. The media ate it up, of course, because nothing sells like a story about wealthy families destroying each other over money. "Socialite couple arrested for stealing millions from own children," ran as the headline in the New York Post, complete with photos of Madison's brownstone and my parents' mansion in Greenwich. Chase called me within hours of the arrests, his voice shaking with shock and betrayal. "Is it true?" he asked, and I could hear that his whole world was crumbling. "Did Mom and Dad really steal our trust funds? Did they really take everything Grandma left us?" I walked him through it as gently as I could, explained the paper trail, showed him the evidence that Diana and Catherine had compiled. He went quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard from my perpetually chill little brother. "I want in on the lawsuit. Whatever you're doing to make them pay, I want in. They stole my future, Rose. They stole from both of us and acted like we should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw our way."
Madison, predictably, lawyered up immediately and tried to distance herself from the whole mess, claiming she'd had no idea about the trust fund theft, that she'd only known about my apartment money and thought it was a legitimate family loan. Her lawyer held a press conference where she stood there looking appropriately devastated, talking about how betrayed she felt by our parents, how she'd been manipulated and used. It was a masterclass in self-preservation and absolute horseshit, because Diana had found emails between Madison and my mother discussing the family investments and managing the trust distributions that proved she'd known way more than she was admitting. When Diana dropped that evidence on Madison's lawyer, I watched my sister's carefully constructed defense crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. The civil suit expanded to include Chase as a plaintiff, and with the criminal charges backing our case, my parents' lawyers started making settlement noises almost immediately. They knew they were screwed, knew that if this went to trial, the jury would take one look at the evidence and award us everything we asked for, plus punitive damages that would destroy what little wealth they had left. The negotiation was brutal and satisfying in equal measure. Diana played hardball, demanding not just the return of our stolen money plus interest, but additional damages for emotional distress, lost opportunities, and punitive damages for the deliberate and malicious nature of the theft. My parents' lawyers tried to argue that they'd always intended to pay it back, that it was a temporary measure during a financial crisis. But that argument died when Catherine Morrison released evidence showing they'd been stealing from the trust for a full decade, long before any financial crisis hit. The settlement conference was held in a sterile office building in Manhattan, all of us sitting around a massive table like we were negotiating a corporate merger instead of trying to piece together the shattered remains of a family. My mother couldn't even look at me, her eyes red and puffy like she'd been crying for days. My father stared at the table, his lawyer doing most of the talking. Madison wasn't there because she'd cut her own deal, agreeing to testify against our parents in exchange for reduced charges and a separate settlement where she'd return my apartment money plus interest. Chase sat next to me, his jaw clenched tight, looking like he wanted to flip the table and walk out. Grandpa William was at the head of the table, presiding over the destruction of his own family with the kind of grim determination that came from knowing this was the only way to make things right.
"My clients are prepared to offer a settlement of $3.2 million, my parents' lawyer said, his voice carefully neutral. This represents the full amount stolen from the trust funds, plus accrued interest, plus an additional sum for emotional damages. In exchange, the plaintiffs will agree not to pursue additional punitive damages and will provide victim impact statements supporting reduced sentencing in the criminal case. He slid the paperwork across the table, like he was offering us a gift instead of returning money that should have been ours all along. Diana picked up the papers, barely glanced at them, and slid them back. $4.5 million, she said flatly. 3.2 covers the trust funds and interest, sure, but it doesn't cover the 3 years Rose spent living in poverty while your clients enjoyed the fruits of their theft. It doesn't cover the opportunities Chase lost because he made life decisions based on believing he had a safety net that didn't exist. It doesn't cover the psychological damage of growing up in a family where your parents would rather steal from you than admit they needed help. 4.5, or we'll see you in court where a jury will probably give us 6. The negotiation went back and forth for 3 hours, my parents' lawyer getting increasingly desperate as Diana refused to budge, and Catherine Morrison sat in the corner with this satisfied smile, knowing the criminal charges gave us all the leverage we needed. Finally, they settled on $4 million to be paid out from the liquidation of my parents' assets. The Greenwich house would be sold, along with my dad's commercial properties and my mom's investment portfolio. Madison's brownstone was already on the market as part of her separate settlement. My parents would be left with basically nothing, living in whatever apartment they could afford on whatever income they could scrape together after their criminal case was resolved, which, according to Catherine, would probably involve at least 3 to 5 years in federal prison for each of them. "There's one more thing," I said, as everyone was getting ready to sign the settlement documents, my voice cutting through the relieved chatter of lawyers who were glad to have this wrapped up. "I want a confession. Not some sanitized statement your lawyers write up. I want them to look at me and Chase and admit what they did. Admit they chose to steal from their own children. Admit they let me struggle while they lived in comfort paid for with my money." I stared at my mother, who finally met my eyes, and I saw something break in her expression. "Rose," she started, her voice cracking, but I held up my hand to stop her. "You don't get to rose me anymore. You don't get to act like we have some kind of relationship that allows you to use my name like that. You're going to confess right here, right now, or I'm walking away from the settlement and letting a jury decide how much your betrayal is worth." The room went silent, lawyers shifting uncomfortably, Grandpa William nodding his approval. Chase leaned forward, his eyes locked on our parents, with an intensity I'd never seen from him. My father cleared his throat, his hands shaking as he clasped them together on the table. "We stole from you," he said quietly, each word seeming to cost him something. "We took money that was supposed to be yours and used it to cover our own mistakes, our own failures. We watched you struggle, Rose, and we said nothing because we were ashamed and scared, and we kept thinking we'd fix it before you ever found out. We robbed Chase of his future security because we were too proud to admit we'd failed, too weak to face the consequences of our choices." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw genuine remorse there too. Too little and way too late. "We destroyed this family because we were cowards, and there's nothing we can say or do that will ever make that right." My mother was openly sobbing now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "I chose Madison over you," she whispered, looking at me with devastation written across her face. "When I had to decide who to help, I chose the daughter who was already stable, who already had everything, because it was easier than admitting we'd failed you. I let you live in that basement because acknowledging your struggle would have meant acknowledging what we'd done. I'm sorry, Rose. I'm so sorry." But her apology felt empty, hollow, like words that couldn't begin to bridge the canyon of hurt between us. "Your apology doesn't change anything," I said, my voice hard despite the tears burning behind my eyes. "It doesn't give me back those 3 years. It doesn't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't good enough for my own family's love. But at least now you've admitted the truth, and that's more than you gave me for the past 3 years." I picked up the pen, signed the settlement documents with a flourish, and slid them across to Chase, who did the same without hesitation. "We're done here. I hope prison gives you time to think about what you destroyed." The criminal trial was mercifully quick, with the settlement documents serving as evidence and both Chase and me providing victim impact statements. My parents' lawyers advised them to plead guilty and hope for leniency. The sentencing hearing was packed with reporters and curious onlookers who wanted to see how the mighty had fallen. I sat in the front row between Chase and Grandpa William, watching as the judge laid into my parents with the kind of righteous anger that comes from seeing people in positions of privilege abuse that privilege to harm their own children. My father got 4 years in federal prison, my mother got 3.5, and Madison got 18 months of house arrest plus 5 years probation for her role as an accessory after the fact. The judge's final words before handing down the sentences stuck with me. "You betrayed the most sacred trust that exists, the trust between parent and child. You stole not just money, but security, opportunity, and the fundamental belief that family means protection. The damage you've caused cannot be measured in dollars, and your punishment, while significant, cannot truly restore what you've taken." 6 months after the sentencing, I stood in the living room of my new apartment. A legitimate 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood with windows that actually let in sunlight and floors that didn't flood when it rained. The settlement money had been distributed, and while it couldn't give me back those 3 years, it had fundamentally changed my life trajectory. It paid off my student loans, put a down payment on the apartment, and invested the rest in a way that would provide security I'd never had before. Chase had done something similar, though he'd also used some of his settlement to start a nonprofit helping young people whose families had stolen from them, turning his pain into something constructive. We'd grown closer through all of this, bonded by shared betrayal and the understanding that sometimes family is something you choose rather than something you're born into. Grandpa William visited regularly, his guilt over not catching the theft sooner slowly easing as he saw Chase and me building stable, independent lives. Madison had reached out a few times, her messages full of excuses and justifications and half-hearted apologies, but I'd blocked her number after the 3rd attempt. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth rebuilding. My parents sent letters from prison, long, rambling things full of regret and excuses and promises to make amends once they were released, but I never read past the first few lines before throwing them away. Their words couldn't change what they'd done, couldn't undo the damage, and I'd learned that forgiveness isn't something you owe people just because they're family, especially when they've proven they don't deserve it. The weirdest part was running into people who knew the story, who'd followed it in the news or heard about it through mutual connections. Some looked at me with pity, like I was damaged goods. Others looked at me with respect, like I was some kind of warrior for standing up to my family. But most just looked uncomfortable, like they didn't know how to process a story where the villain was someone's parents and the hero had to destroy her whole family to get justice. I learned to handle those interactions with a simple statement. They made their choices, I made mine, and I'm better off for it. Because it was true. I was better off, even with the scars and the trauma and the complicated grief that came from mourning a family that had never really existed the way I'd thought it did. One evening, about a year after everything had blown up, I was having dinner with some coworkers when one of them asked me if I had any regrets about how I'd handled things. "Do you ever wish you'd just taken a settlement and kept it quiet?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Like, was it worth destroying your whole family over money? And I realized that people who hadn't lived through what I lived through would never really understand that it was never about the money. Not really. It wasn't about the money, I explained, putting down my fork and meeting her eyes. It was about the fact that the people who were supposed to protect me, who were supposed to love me unconditionally, chose to harm me instead. It was about holding them accountable for that betrayal, because if I didn't, I'd be teaching myself that I don't matter, that my pain doesn't count, that family can do whatever they want to me, and I'm supposed to just take it. I destroyed my family because they destroyed me first, And I decided I was worth more than being their forgotten daughter, their acceptable sacrifice, their dirty little secret. I could see understanding dawning in her expression, that moment when someone realizes that justice sometimes requires burning everything down to build something better from the ashes. The moral of my story, if there even is one, isn't some neat little package about forgiveness or family bonds being unbreakable. The moral is that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who will hurt you the deepest, and you have every right to protect yourself from that harm, even if it means walking away from the whole mess. The moral is that blood doesn't entitle anyone to abuse, steal from, or neglect you. And standing up for yourself isn't selfish or cruel, it's survival. The moral is that real family isn't determined by genetics or last names, but by who shows up for you, who protects you, who values you enough to tell you the truth even when it's hard. Grandpa William was more family to me than my parents ever were because he chose me, protected me, and stood by me even when it cost him the relationship with his own son. I learned that revenge isn't always about hurting people back. Sometimes it's about refusing to let them keep hurting you, about building a life they can't touch, about proving that you're stronger than their worst intentions. I learned that justice and revenge aren't opposites, but sometimes the same thing. That holding people accountable for their actions is both the right thing to do and deeply, satisfyingly personal. I learned that you can grieve for the family you thought you had while simultaneously celebrating your freedom from the family you actually had. That those two feelings can exist side by side without contradicting each other. 2 years later, I got an email from my mother sent from some address I didn't recognize because I'd blocked all her usual ones. The subject line said, "Please read this." And against my better judgment, I did. She'd been released from prison on good behavior, was living in a small apartment in New Jersey, working a regular job for the first time in her privileged life.
The email was different from her earlier attempts at contact. No excuses, no justifications, just a simple acknowledgement of everything she'd destroyed, and a statement that she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know she understood, finally, what she'd taken from me. She ended with, "You deserved better, and I failed you in every way a mother can fail her child. I hope you've built a beautiful life without us." I read it 3 times, felt the complicated swirl of emotions that came with seeing my mother brought so low, and then I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Because I'd learned that you don't have to engage with someone's guilt just because they finally feel it. Chase and I had lunch every week now, our relationship rebuilt on honesty and shared understanding. He'd become an advocate for victims of family financial abuse, using his story to push for stronger legal protections and better support systems. Grandpa William had updated his will, leaving everything to Chase and me in a trust so ironclad that no one could touch it, managed by trustees who weren't family and had no conflicts of interest. Madison had reached out to Chase a few times, trying to rebuild some kind of relationship, but he'd been clear. She could be in his life when she fully acknowledged her role in everything and made genuine amends, not just superficial apologies designed to ease her conscience. As for me, I thrived in ways I never could have when I was still trying to earn my family's approval. I got promoted at work, started consulting on high-profile cases of family financial fraud, even spoke at conferences about the psychology of family betrayal and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable regardless of their relationship to you. I dated, traveled, invested in friendships with people who actually showed up for me. I built a life that was wholly mine, paid for with money I'd fought for, filled with people I'd chosen, anchored in the knowledge that I was worth fighting for, even when nobody else would. The scar tissue from those 3 years in the basement never fully faded, but it became part of my story rather than the whole of it. Sometimes I still felt that flash of rage when I remembered sitting at that brunch, hearing Grandpa ask about an apartment I'd never received, feeling the crushing weight of realizing my family had stolen from me. But that rage had transformed into something more useful, a fierce commitment to never let anyone treat me as less than I was worth, a determination to use my experience to help others who'd been similarly betrayed, a recognition that surviving someone's worst intentions makes you powerful in ways they can never take away.
If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, the girl living in that flooded basement wondering why she wasn't enough, I'd tell her that she was enough, that the problem was never her worth, but their willingness to see it. I'd tell her that the family she was mourning had never really existed, except in her hopeful imagination, and that losing something that was never real isn't actually a loss, but a revelation. I'd tell her that choosing yourself over people who don't choose you isn't selfish. It's the first step toward building a life where you're not constantly trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I'd tell her that revenge, when it's really about justice and self-respect, tastes exactly like freedom, and that freedom is worth every uncomfortable conversation, every severed relationship, every moment of doubt and fear and rage. In the end, my family's greatest gift to me wasn't the apartment they never bought or the trust fund they stole. It was teaching me that I could survive their betrayal and come out stronger. They taught me that blood means nothing without respect, that forgiveness is earned, not demanded, that walking away from toxicity is an act of self-love, not selfishness. They taught me, through their worst actions, what kind of person I never wanted to become and what kind of family I would eventually build for myself, one based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and appearances. And maybe, in some twisted way, that knowledge was worth every painful moment, every tear, every night spent wondering if I'd made the right choice to burn it all down. Because I did make the right choice. I chose me, and I'd make the same choice again without hesitation.